Welcome to Management Lab. That might sound surprising to some of you who have listened to us already. We are rebranding from our previous title of What Do You Make of This? Just experimenting with some things we're early on. We'll see where it goes. At any rate, this is Sean Hansen from Saunders College of Business at Rochester Institute of Technology in beautiful Rochester, New York.
And I'm Uri Gal from the University of Sydney in Sydney, Australia. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm all right. There's something I want to share with you.
Go for it.
I had an experience late last week on Friday.
Do I need to steel myself for this revelation?
No. You're going to be okay, I think. So we're going to be talking about AI today. That's going to be the topic of the conversation. And Sam
Again, that's 2 weeks in a row. Fun times.
Sort of, yes. But different aspects of the phenomenon. And
right.
Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, was in Melbourne last week. He came, he's gone through this global tour where he went to a bunch of different countries and talked up his company and explained to everybody how wonderful the technology is. And the last stop on his tour was in Melbourne. So we had this big event, and as it happens, my wife was the person who got to interview him. And it was an interesting experience in more than one way. You're making a face. Why are you making a face?
It's awesome. That's so cool.
Oh, yeah.
That's really exciting.
It was very exciting, especially because half an hour before she had to go up on stage, we got a call from the school to say that our daughter was sick. So we had to juggle a few balls at the same time. But at any rate, the conversation was interesting. Not because he said something that was revolutionarily new relative to what he had said before, but I guess it occurred to me more clearly than before that he's really on a sales trip. I think that's one of the primary reasons he's gone on that trip. And so there are a few things that he said that made me think that way. So one of the questions that he got asked was, you've been on this 5 or 6 week tour, you've been asked hundreds of different questions probably. What question do you wish you had been asked that you haven't been asked? And
Nora asked this one?
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
And the answer he gave was, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, that he feels there was too much emphasis on the negative and not enough emphasis on the positive and all the amazing consequences that the technology might have.
Interesting.
So I guess in retrospect, it's not surprising that he would give such an answer, but given all the conversations around how forthcoming he's been in relation to regulation and acknowledging the risks of generative AI, I thought that was a bit interesting. Although
what would you say, just in eyeballing the open coverage, I don't want to take away from the discussion, but eyeballing general sort of popular press, tech press coverage, what percentage would you say has been negatively framed as opposed to positively framed?
It's a good question. I'm really not sure. I think this is a case where you have these echo chambers, and I think I'm pretty deeply steeped in one of them that probably emphasizes the more critical way of looking at this technology. But I'm sure there's been lots and lots of positive coverage. I mean, if you go on LinkedIn and there's so many posts of here are the 10 prompts that are going to increase your productivity by 50% and increase your revenue by 500%. So I really think it depends where you look. What's your sense?
My estimation would be 4-1, but that could, as you know, that could be a reflection of the types of circles that I inhabit. But I would say 4-1 negative to positive.
Really?
Where a large percentage has emphasized the fears about generative AI in particular. And what we're going to be talking about today goes beyond just generative AI. But OpenAI's real mark has been in the generative space. They, in addition to ChatGPT, as I recall, OpenAI is the parent behind Dali, the Dali image generator. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have another application that generates music, I believe. I forget what it's called, but I think it's part
just
of
the
this.
one that did a Drake and Weekend mashup or something, generated a brand new Drake Weekend mashup.
I'm not sure. But I know he was asked about it in relation to copyrights violations, and his response was that it wasn't meant to be a big deal, but application that they didn't really emphasize it. Anyway, that was his response, which I thought was interesting. He did kind of offhandedly mention. I think he was asked about it, or maybe he was asked about the risks in general, and he mentioned one risk that people might use ChatGPT to create new super dangerous pathogens, and that he was concerned about that.
Well, I don't want to send us off on a tangent, but I don't know if you've seen some of the recent reporting that suggests that the COVID-19 was indeed the product of a biological warfare initiative.
Yeah, that's
this is not conspiracy theory. There's real reporting, but we could cut this all out if you want.
No, but let's just leave it there, because if we do get into this, we can easily spend an hour just talking about that and going back and forth.
Fair enough. So tonight or today for you, we're not talking about generative AI in particular, but we are looking at the practical workplace implications of artificial intelligence. And we wanted to sort of delve into, all right, all this discussion about artificial intelligence and machine learning tools, but we don't necessarily have a great sense of what the practical implications to date are in the workplace.
Yeah, and it feels like there's been a renewed interest in those questions in the wake of the release of tools like ChatGPT and Bard, all those different types of what we call generative AI systems, whose primary capability is to, as the name suggests, to generate new content, be it text or images or video. Because it is kind of important to keep this, to put this in a broader perspective, which is that AI technologies of different types have been with us for decades, right? AI in itself is not a new phenomenon. It's just we've seen significant advancements in computing capability and data analysis capability and storage capability that have enabled all these different advancements that we've seen in the last few years. And it's reached a point where these technologies have become so good that people are actually able to see in a pretty intuitive way that they have very applicable uses in the workplace.
Yeah. Do you think, by the way, since we've already talked about this topic to some degree, do you think we need to define some terms at all? And in particular, what I'm thinking here is when we talk about artificial intelligence, as you noted, has existed in various forms, neural networks being one of the earliest, but in various forms over many generations. But in particular, the machine learning and deep learning tools have really seen a huge explosion in the last 10, right? And I think that's what's driving a lot of the innovation that we're seeing. And so I don't know. What do you think? Should we quickly?
Yeah. Do you want to quickly define machine learning?
Yeah, this is back of the envelope. I don't have a good definition in front of me, but I think the differentiating elements of machine learning, and then deep learning basically builds off of machine learning. But the defining elements of machine learning are algorithmic tools, again, building software and rule sets that can improve their own performance over time on whatever tasks or objectives are set before it. So the key that's the learning element of the machine learning piece, is that the algorithm can continue to get better by pulling in variables and deciding how variables and metrics should be combined to improve their performance in accuracy, predictive or probabilistic accuracy.
And another key element in machine learning systems is that they require large quantities of data in order to improve their performance over time, right? So we have to train those algorithms on large quantities of data that represent whatever the domain of interest might be. So it might be images if we're looking to develop a system that classifies images into different types, or It might be performance of employees in organizations, if that's the type of algorithm we want to develop. For instance, if we want to have some sort of a hiring algorithm to rank different applicants based on their capabilities and stuff like that. So large quantities of data are an essential piece of these machine learning algorithms. And like you said before, neural networks and deep learning, which is kind of an advanced version of neural networks, are one instantiation, one type of machine learning algorithms. It's a specific architecture of machine learning algorithms that's kind of at the core of all this generative AI. I don't know if I want to use the word revolution, but rise of generative AI systems.
Yeah, I think it's pretty revolutionary. I think what we're seeing is pretty revolutionary. So we'll go into some of what the research says, but I do think before we talk about sort of these early indications, it's important for us to acknowledge that there's a real indeterminacy right now of the phenomenon, meaning the extant literature on the practical implications of these tools is quite limited.
Yeah.
There's a lot of indication that that the impacts are going to be enormous, and lots of predictions that they're going to be enormous, including this is not something we studied, but Susskind and Susskind wrote a book a couple years ago that basically said we're looking at the end of professions, right? Like professions will cease to exist altogether in the near term. So in terms of the impact that various people are predicting, it's almost unlimited, but it's very indeterminate exactly where this is going to go right now. So I think it's key that even as we review some of this research, there's not going to be a lot of concrete answers. There's not a lot of do this, not that kind of solutions to be had.
Yeah, which is not entirely surprising given how recent advancements have been in this space. But yeah, what we see are initial indications of what might be coming. By the way, what you just said, the fact that it's still new, reminded me of something else that Sam Altman said on it was on Friday last week, which made me think that he was on a sales tour. When asked, how do you think organizations should use tools like ChatGPT and other generative AI systems to increase innovation within the company, his response, and again I'm paraphrasing, was use it for everything immediately. Which
Interesting.
Which basically contradicts pretty much everything that we know about implementation of systems into organizations. But his response was that use it for everything as soon as you can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he's the leader of an organization. He is necessarily on a promotional tour, if not a full sales tour. Yeah.
Sure, but it kind of I agree. But when you think about the kind of people he's met with, like heads of state, diplomats, so he's obviously more than just a tech guy at this stage, right? It's gone beyond that. But anyway, let's circle back.
Do you have an OpenAI subscription? Do you do the $20 a month?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're not alone. I know that as a department chair, a lot of my faculty or some of my faculty have come forward and said, could I please get the subscription? And I'm inclined to support them in that regard. But it makes me realize that we could very soon have an entire generation or an entire cohort of people in sort of, I don't know, in intelligentsia writ large. So academic profession or academic domains, professional domains, things like that, seeking to get the subscription. $20 a month, if we call that what? 10% of the world's population, $20 a month. That's a big revenue source, right? So sure, he's selling.
Oh yeah. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. Okay, let's circle back to the topic at hand. So we were just saying that research on the topic is still in its infancy because it's a pretty recent phenomenon, but we have, in preparation for the day, we have found a few studies that empirically demonstrate some of the impacts of some of these tools in a workplace context.
Yeah, and there were two in particular that I would like us to sort of touch on, because I thought they really reinforced one another really strongly. And interesting, these were both working papers. So there was a paper by Brynjolfsson, Eric Brynjolfsson, Lee and Raymond. So Brynjolfsson, Lee, and Raymond. This is a National Bureau of Economic Research working paper called Generative AI at Work. And then I'm just going to give both titles. The other one was Noy and Zhang, and this is currently an SSRN working paper called Experimental Evidence on the Productivity Effects of Generative Artificial Intelligence. And we can talk about some of the disentangle the two, but what they found in both is in case studies of actual applications of these technologies, they see real significant productivity increases from the use of these tools. In the one case, it was ChatGPT. The other case, was it actually it was a proprietary generative AI software for customer service support. But in both cases, they said, the people using the tools, you see real productivity enhancements, both in terms of the amount of time it takes them to do their work, the successful outcome rate, customer satisfaction, all of these things go up. Time goes down, but the rest goes up. And interestingly, the benefits accrue to the lowest skilled workers.
Well, there were several different findings that came out of the the name is a mouthful, Brynjolfsson study.
Brynjolfsson.
Yeah. So the setting of that study was a call center, right? Mm-hmm. And so they looked at how the use of this tool improved or impacted people's work in this context.
Yeah. And this was, the software was prompting people with responses to consumers, different scripts for responses to consumers, yes, ways, solutions to propose to consumers, things of that nature.
Exactly. So it was given advice in real time as to how to manage the conversation with actual suggestions of actual text to say back to the customers. And what they found was a 13.8% increase in the number of chats that were successfully resolved, as well as a decline in the time that it took those individuals to resolve those chats. So improvement both in time and in, I guess, a quality would be kind of a proxy construct to describe this. Like you said, they also found a disproportional increase in the performance of the less skilled individuals who work there. So it kind of narrowed the gap between the less skilled and the more skilled individuals with the introduction of this technology, which I think is something that we need to talk about the significance of this.
Yeah, I think it's really intriguing.
And yeah, and they also say that the high skilled workers may have less to gain because AI recommendations capture tacit knowledge, arguably, right? That's what they say, tacit knowledge, and kind of disseminate this tacit knowledge to people who didn't have it before, thereby allowing them to catch up with the more skilled workers.
And then we could just quickly summarize the other study and talk about how these things do relate. The other study took college-educated professionals and asked them to write an essay, like gave them an essay writing exercise. And for half of the group, they gave them access to ChatGPT. They had them sign up with ChatGPT and to use that to support their essay writing. And the other half was the control group, so they were not to use ChatGPT. And here again, you saw a significant increase, fairly dramatic increase in the sort of time, decrease in the time it took to write the essays, but corresponding increase in quality of essays. But as with the previous study that we noted, the benefits really accrued to the lower skill, the people who had lower scores on quality in there was a pretest condition where they were to write something initially before using any tool. And those that had the lowest scores saw the greatest benefit from the use of the tool. So in both these cases, we have real substantive increases in effectiveness, efficiency, if we measure that in time. So both of those, and the greatest benefit accruing to the lower skilled individuals.
Do you think that's a good thing, that the gap narrows?
So I don't know. I'm conflicted on this. I think there is certainly a good element to it, because there's a degree to which this is, if you might recall, Uri, as an information systems person like myself, back in the 1990s and 2000s, there was a lot of talk about what were called expert systems. So what they tried to do was to sort of build expertise, human expertise, into decision support systems, software that would help guide people through a process. And it was a kind of a bust. It never really worked as anticipated. And what occurs to me is now we have seen it come to fruition. This is effectively expert systems coming to pass, right? Where the tools are providing the expertise.
Exactly. So the rationale for those expert systems was that anybody who's not an expert could use these systems to gain access to expert knowledge that's embedded in them. And
Right.
I think I didn't think about this that way, but I think you're right. I think with the introduction of these tools that embody so much information because they've been trained on the entire internet pretty much, and they are able to present the information in a very intuitive, human-like format, which wasn't really the case before, not in such a sophisticated way. People really do, it seems like, are really able to gain access to this expert information or expert skills, which they didn't have before, and embed them successfully into their own work to a degree. Because one other thing that study by Noy and Zhang found, that's the essay writing task that people were given, that most people use the tool as a replacement for their own writing, right? So I think the number was 68% of the treatment group. This is the group that was given access to ChatGPT. So 68% of them reported not editing ChatGPT's output after it was given to them.
Right.
Which I guess, you know, I think it's a pretty significant caveat in terms of making any conclusive statements about how this technology can increase or help people upskill. So it definitely increases their productivity and heightens the quality of their work, but is it really their work?
Right. I think that when I say I'm conflicted on this, part of it is the fear that this leads to a downskilling, where no one acquires the skill if they don't need to. Right. Where basically in any professional domain, people acquire skills because they think it'll make them better in a competitive landscape or something like that. But if people have tools at their fingertips that basically can make them just as good as the next person, then will they acquire that skill? Right. If I could suddenly shoot as well as Steph Curry, I'm not going to go spend hours. Don't smirk like that. Don't even do it.
I just remember.
But if I could,
I remember our days, our days playing basketball together when we were PhD students, and even 20 years ago. Let me tell you, my friend, you were no Steph Curry. You weren't even a Larry Bird. So
it's true. I am not a shooter. I am not a shooter.
Or a jumper.
I use my. Well, look, I'm a big guy though, so I can use my size to own the block. That's about it.
Yeah, you were like,
but fair enough.
If I may say so, like a downgraded version of Kevin McHale.
I am gonna jump through this. Actually, I'll take that. I'll take McHale for sure. You didn't go with Bill Lambier. Anyway.
Yeah, actually, that's a better one.
But the point is, if I could make myself as good a shooter as Steph Curry, then I'm not going to spend hours in the gym, right? And so there's a fear that I have that these tools, if it can make anyone, I mean, there's an egalitarian vision that it creates where it gives everyone at their fingertips the ability to sort of compete in a given landscape. There's just something about it that worries me that it's going to undermine the drive to try to excel in lots of different frontiers.
So you're concerned it might decrease individual motivation to learn new skills or to apply new skills?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So I guess an interesting question is, and if we think back about previous waves of technological breakthroughs, I think it's almost always been the case that with any new technological innovation that was revolutionary in some sense across multiple domains and societies, if you think about the technological revolution in the 1800s in Europe, it's always been the case, I feel like.
Are you referring to what we call the Industrial Revolution?
Industrial Revolution, yeah, sorry. It's always been the case that there were concerns around what are people going to do with these new technologies, because what the skills that they had that used to be valuable in the market are now becoming obsolete very quickly. And so, but the counter argument has always been that, yes, those old skills are not going to be useful anymore, but it gives people it frees up people's time, right? So they can learn new skills, more advanced skills. So rather than be engaged, for 16 hours a day in repetitive manual work, they're going to be able to learn new skills and apply, I don't know, more critical thinking and reflection and high-level thinking in the workplace to increase their productivity and be more useful. The question is, when you
Right.
have a tool like these generative AI systems, which do those skills so well, right? They're able to at least emulate thinking and synthesis and writing at a very high level. What is the next step? What is the next, level of
What's the unique?
tasks?
What's unique to us? Yeah, and I think it's a good question. I think it's a good question. I don't. I think the historical context that you set up is actually really valuable. And one of the other papers that we looked at highlighted this, but this is something that whenever I talk about the sort of growth of AI, I like to go back to the historical context, because a term we still use today, Luddite, comes from the followers of a guy named Samuel Ludd back during the Industrial Revolution, who went around smashing mechanical looms because they were seamstresses or weavers. And so they went around smashing mechanical looms because their thinking was it's taking our jobs away. And I think we see the same. I mean, one of the biggest points of discussion around this whole technology is this idea of technological unemployment, that you're going to see technology-based displacement from jobs. And I do think it's a realistic concern. I think there are reasons for it. But if we do take the historical context, you're right that every previous wave of technological innovation actually created many more jobs and classes of jobs than it destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
The difference, and we're maybe getting a little afield from the research itself, is the pace at which that's happening. Meaning that is certainly true for every previous wave of technological innovation, but it's happening so fast now that the ability of individual human beings to reskill from one professional orientation to another becomes a very open question.
Yeah, I agree. Almost no one talked about generative AI before the end of last year, and we're in the middle of 2023 and everybody is talking about it. And with all the excitement and the dread that's involved in these conversations. So I think this, more cynical individuals than me would say we've always talked about speed, and people have always talked about being in the midst of a revolutionary era because we like to think that we live in special times because that makes us special. But maybe there's something that's actually different this time around, at least in terms of the pace. And we're not even getting into this whole conversation around whether AI is such a unique, or with the recent advancements in AI, such a unique technology that it might actually bring about the demise of the human race, right? That's a different conversation in terms of how.
Yeah, we'll leave that one aside.
How unique the times really are. We'll leave it aside, but we can't ignore it at the same time, right?
No,
because it is an indication of just how special, for good and for bad, these technologies are. It's not like the invention. Let me just finish the point. It's not like the invention of an automated machine to produce more cars per hour. It's a different type of technology that, like you said before, has the capacity to self-improve, which is one of the key reasons why people are so concerned about what might happen.
So my gut feeling is I agree with you, but I also have this sense that everyone in each of those previous waves of innovation felt exactly the same way. They felt that the wave they were living through was unique vis-a-vis the ones they had seen before. I saw in one of the papers that we looked at, we don't have to go to this one right now, but this was by Jarahi from Business Horizons. But he included a quote in that paper that was from John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s. I just want to throw it out here now. John Maynard Keynes, of course, a key economic thinker and one of the real drivers behind what in the United States wound up becoming the New Deal economic plans. But this from a 1930 article, Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren, in which he described technological unemployment as a new disease. So Keynes seemed to think he was on the brink of unprecedented technological displacement back closing in on 100 years ago.
Yeah, so maybe history rhymes with itself.
Yeah,
and we are kind of back in the loop in a similar place where we were before, more than just once.
So I think one of the key insights that seems to be coming out of the literature that is, I think, a little more optimistic, at least leads me toward a more optimistic line of thinking, is strong indications that the greatest benefits don't come from a replacement of human with computer, but come from what might be called, good Lord, there goes my microphone, but come from what might be called human computer, or I guess has been called human computer collaboration. So where we have work tasks in which you have humans using computers, right, to do, and using artificial intelligence to pursue various tasks. And across a number of studies here, we see pretty good evidence that the humans in collaboration with the computers generate better outcomes than either the humans or the algorithms by themselves in isolation.
Yeah, so we saw specifically one study by Fuggener et al. From Information Systems Research. Yep.
That you's got an umlaut over it.
Oh, I apologize.
Anyway, sorry. Yeah.
I'm pretty sure you're not saying it right either, so don't pitch.
I'm sure I'm not.
Cognitive challenges in human artificial intelligence. And they found, they ran an online experiment, and the task that they gave people was, or AI, was to classify images into different types of images, and they then measured the accuracy of their classification. And they looked at different conditions. One was they let the AI work alone, they let the human work alone, and then they looked at what happens when the human delegates work to the AI, and what they call inversion, which is the opposite of that, when AI delegates work to the human. And they compared the levels of accuracy across these different 4 conditions. And guess what they found? Can you guess, Sean?
Well, I'm cheating because I know the research. But right. Yeah, what they found was that, again, the humans in collaboration with the computers did the best, but specifically under the condition in which the AI delegated the tasks, or the classification task, and the humans exercised the classification task. But this is very interesting to me because it suggests. Go ahead.
Just to put things in the right order. So that was the most accurate condition when the AI delegated to the human, and that was followed by the AI working alone. And then the third most accurate condition was when the human delegated to the AI, and the least accurate condition was the human acting alone.
Yeah, the human by themselves was the worst performance.
Yeah.
But what's intriguing to me here is, number one, the insight that the collaborative element, the interaction between the human and the algorithm, can make a difference. But also that it starts to give us a sense of, well, which party should do which, right? Like if we're starting to talk from, which we'll get to in a little bit, about managerial implications, I think it's helpful to say, well, what types of things should we have the technology do? And what types of things should we reserve to the human beings? And simply thinking, oh, well, as long as they're working with the technology, humans do some and computers do some, it'll be fine, is not a great path forward. Like, we want to think about the types of tasks that we have the computing do, as opposed to those that we as human beings think we should reserve to ourselves.
Yeah. And one way of thinking about this comes from a different paper that we looked at by Jarahi, 2018, which I think he touched on briefly before.
Right.
And where he talks about, he talks about 3 different types of decision making that managers typically make in organizations. 3 different elements that are involved in those decisions.
Aspects of organizational life, essentially, right?
Yeah, but specific to decision making. So one type or condition of decision making has to do with uncertainty, which is where we make decisions under uncertain conditions, where we don't have all the information that we want to make a kind of, to borrow from Simon's work, Herbert Simon. We don't have all the information we need to make a fully rational decision. So we kind of satisfies in a way, right? So that's uncertainty. We have missing information. A second condition is complex.
Just quick definition. Satisfice is not the same as satisfy. Satisfice means under a situation where we have limited information, we do as best as we can, essentially, in a decision domain.
Yeah. The second condition is complexity, where we have too much information, so that we kind of experience information overload, and we don't have the capacity, the cognitive capacity to fully process all this information. And the third condition or type of decision-making environment that we deal with as managers and organizations is what he calls equivocality, which involves dealing with divergent interpretations of a given decision-making situation, right? And
where there's high ambiguity.
Yeah, and he talks about political kind of negotiation type of decisions that or situations that managers have to deal with in organization, where we have different groups with different interests and different ways of framing a given situation, and managers have to navigate these equivocal situations to make a decision there. And in each of these conditions, he talks about how AI can be used by managers to help them make good decisions. So in the condition of uncertainty, which, just to remind everybody, involves not having enough information, he talks about how AI can be used to find patterns in existing data to generate new ideas, even in the data that we do have. And as we know, AI algorithms are very effective at scanning large amounts of data very quickly and finding patterns, correlations in the data in ways that humans might have not thought about.
Yeah. So just to interject quickly, idea generation, anomaly detection, like figuring out if there's something anomalous in the data set, or market scanning, like scanning the market to see if there are events occurring. This could relate, of course, to anomaly detection, but to determine if there are events to which human actors need to respond, something like that, under conditions of uncertainty.
And the role of the human in this situation would be to provide what humans have a particular strength in, which is the intuitive side of decision making, which is not based on clear decision rules, right? It's based on prior experiences that we've had dealing with similar situations time and time again over years, to the point that when we experience a similar situation in the future, it's already kind of baked into us what needs to be done, not because we think about this explicitly and add up all the different elements in the current decision situation. It's just because that by taking a snapshot of the situation, we figure out that, yes, we've seen this before. It's similar to what we've done in that previous situation, and that's kind of what we need to do right now. So there's no deliberate, rule following thought process there that precedes the decision. It's just something that feels right to us.
I was a little dissatisfied with this, by the way.
With my explanation?
No, not your explanation, that argument. I like the idea of leaving the decision to the human, because we're often better in novel situations. One of the things we know about the algorithms is if we have real novelty, they often don't adapt well because they are entirely driven by past content, right? And so if we have something really fundamentally different, then a human might be better equipped to generate a solution. So I like that element. What I didn't love is the resorting to the concept of intuition. It just seems too loose to me, right? Like, where it's sort of like a bailout for the humans. Well, the computer doesn't have intuition. Well, okay, how are we defining intuition?
Well, I don't disagree, but he gave examples that might help everybody make sense of this. He talked about investment decisions. And investment obviously involves a lot of future thinking, and we don't know much about the future. It's just an extrapolation from the past that might help us figure out what's going to happen in the future, but we don't know because it hasn't happened yet. And so there's lots of missing information, and the best way to address these sort of situations as a human being, according to the paper, is by using intuition. And so when we make investment decisions, even strategic ones, and I think he talked about Steve Jobs there, if I'm not mistaken, and how whenever he used to make one of these big strategic decisions, it was intuitive. It just felt right. He had a gut feel that this is the right decision to make, and he wasn't able to fully explain why that decision was the best one to make.
So I'm not critiquing the researcher, but I find that to be a weak argument, because you can always pick an example of someone who made several good decisions. There are also great examples that get lost to history of people who made the dumbass decision, right? Who trusted their intuition and said, no, I'm gonna invest in the penny farthing bicycle design or some shit like that. I don't know. Like there's intuition to me just is one that is too loose, conceptually too loose a concept. And you can come up with examples to support it, but anecdote is not data.
But just to try and stillman the argument that I thought he was trying to make, it's not just human intuition, right? It's the collaboration between human intuition and AI scanning data for patterns. So it might be that
human decision making informed by
so it might be that the scanning will highlight certain correlations or point at a new direction that we might want to go in terms of, I don't know, this market might be particularly lucrative in the coming year for whatever reason, or we might want to focus on this segment of customers because these are the numbers from the last 5 years and that's what they're pointing at. So given this information, this particular framing of the situation, then the intuition kicks in. I think that's what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so these
do you want to quickly hit the complexity one and the equivocality ones?
Yeah, so complexity is where we have too much information. And again, we can use AI to simplify the situation for us by finding patterns in the data. Because again, AI is really good at doing this. It's scanning huge amounts of data that humans have no chance of going through in a lifetime sometimes, very quickly to find patterns. And humans, not entirely dissimilarly from what we said before, can make the final call, right? So for instance, we could use AI to scan Twitter to find potentially harmful content that we might want to remove, maybe not under Musk, maybe before, but whatever. And then it would be a human call whether or not this content is actually harmful in the specific context in which it was uttered, and then make the call whether or not to remove the content. So that's how these two capabilities can complement each other. And finally, equivocality. And again, to remind everybody, these are those politically charged situations where we have multiple interpretations of a given event or thing. And here he gives an example of how AI might be used to conduct different types of sentiment analyses to gauge reactions or potential reactions to managerial decisions, right? So we would be better informed about how to conduct ourselves as managers and what types of decisions we might want to make. And the role of the human in this situation would be, which is kind of a conventional, traditional way of thinking about what managers, or at least good managers, should be doing, which is to engage in persuasion and negotiation to kind of construct a vision for the organization and rally support for that vision.
And consensus building, Yeah, this one really reminded me of our discussion last time about the ethical reasoning tools. And one of the papers we looked at said, well, the machine goes back and forth on the trolley problem, right? It gives inconsistent advice. And this is definitely one of those where I see a real uniqueness for human beings where, okay, when we're dealing with ambiguous or equivocal conditions, that's when human beings can come in and say, okay, give me all the perspectives. And I think we talked about this last time. Give me all the perspectives so I can make a judicious decision. And then I'll choose the path and I'll give my reasoning for it.
Yeah. Another thing that struck me that wasn't mentioned in the paper, specifically in those equivocal, politically charged situations, is the human touch. Because oftentimes negotiations involve catering not just to the rational or factual argument, but also it's a very emotive, or it can be a very emotive situation where people's identities and they're psychologically driven, not just economically driven. Let's put it that way. And I think addressing those elements of the situation still, I would argue, are primarily are the responsibility of the human manager and not the AI. So that's something else I think we're still uniquely still not sure for how much longer, but we uniquely positioned to handle adequately.
We hold on to it as long as we can, right?
Yes, I think so.
There's one last study I would like to touch on before we turn to sort of our takeaways. And this was, and I don't know that you read it, and so I'll try to summarize it and just maybe get your reaction on the fly. But this was by Ransbotham et al. This was, I believe, published in MIT Sloan Management Review, but it was a product of a study of a research team and a group from Boston Consulting Group, or a team from Boston Consulting Group. The title of the paper is Expanding AI's Impact with Organizational Learning. And the core, a couple key insights were, this was a couple years, actually, let me check the date really quick. 2020, so 2 years ago. So AI was still pretty widespread at the time. And their insight is that a lot of organizations are focusing on the use of AI. Huge majorities are saying this is a top priority. But of those that implement it in various ways, a small minority have achieved any benefits from it. We saw the earlier studies where maybe this is shifting, but at least a couple of years ago, something like 10% of companies achieve some significant financial benefit from AI adoption. And if the companies also involved, I think it was some labor development, skill training and things like that, it still only increased the benefits to like 1 in 5 firms. So you have a lot of companies spending a lot of time and energy trying to use AI to be more effective, and a small percentage of them are achieving real, substantive, concrete benefits from it. So that's one key insight, which is kind of interesting. The takeaway that the study has is essentially that in order to really benefit from AI adoption, organizations have to invest in organizational learning around the use of AI. So they have to facilitate, systemic and continuous learning experiences between the humans and the machine and the technology. They have to develop multiple ways for humans to interact with the technology, so different modes of interaction, and they have to focus on sort of continuous learning. I think the phrase they used was they change to learn and they learn to change, right? Mm-hmm. And it's only in those conditions where organizations are sort of investing in the innovation around the technology that they're achieving any substantive gains.
Yeah.
So based on that summary, do you have any quick reactions to it?
I think the finding or the argument makes sense to me, and it's very consistent with decades of research in information systems and management, which clearly indicate across dozens of studies, if not more, many of them empirical studies that looked at the implementation of different types of technologies into organizations and what actually drives productivity increases in those organizations. It's not just enough to put the technology in, right? Mm-hmm. You have to actually get people to use the technology in the way that it was intended to be used. And so just...
I don't even know, just a quick interjection. Intended to be used is an open question, because I think a lot of the learning that organizations have to go through is what's the way that it will work effectively. It might be totally different than how it was intended to be used by designers or something like that.
So I think
this is an organic and emergent.
It also depends on the
emergent piece here.
It also depends on the technology, right? Because if we're talking about, I don't know, just to go back to the 80s or 90s, like an ERP system that has very specific uses and the way people are meant to utilize it is pretty heavily scripted. There's only so much that you can deviate from, how it was meant to be used by the designers. But if you're talking about something like ChatGPT, which is a much more generalized, open digital technology that can be used for, I don't know, thousands of different scenarios to achieve thousands of different objectives, then you're going to have much more flexibility.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I think one of the things we've seen from this other research is that it's good at some stuff and not as good at other stuff, right? Like it's an open question whether or not it's good in all applications.
But in either scenario, the point that they're making in the paper makes sense to me, in that you need to have complementary capabilities within the organization to actually leverage the capability of the technology. Sure. And we know this from previous research. So it's not just about plugging this in, giving people access to it, and voila, productivity is gonna jump by 50%. That's not gonna be the case in most situations. And this is where I want to kind of rethink more critically a bit about the two studies we mentioned before, the two experiments that we talked about. There, people didn't really have a choice whether or not to use the technology. It was part of the experiment. They had to use it, right? And it was a very well delineated, clear, unequivocal situation where they knew exactly what they needed to do, which is not necessarily going to be the case in a real organizational situation. It's going to be much more open-ended. There's going to be a bunch of different variables or noise coming at them from different directions about what they need to do, different people telling them different things and this and that. Like we all know, organizational life is dynamic and can be quite complex and indeterminate. So I'm not sure, and we just don't know, like we said before, because this is still early days with this technology, what kind of impacts it's going to have in different situations. And my sense is that we're going to see, like we've seen before with different technologies, different types of productivity gains in different types of situations, especially with a generalized tool like ChatGPT or different generative AI systems that can be used in so many different ways. But I do think that if organizations do want to increase their chances of seeing productivity gains, and by the way, not just productivity gains, we kind of skipped over this before, but one of the findings that came out of the study that looked at ChatGPT in the essay writing situation was that people had an increased satisfaction with performing the task when they use ChatGPT. So it's not just productivity, it's also about at least potentially making people more satisfied in the workplace, which is really important.
Yeah.
But if organizations want to achieve those gains, they have to have these complementary capabilities. So things like, have a champion in the organization that clearly delineates what the technology is going to be used for. What are the specific use cases for which it's going to be used? How are people meant to use it? What kind of organizational restructuring might happen as a consequence of using these tools? What kind of culture do we want to have in place that might help people perhaps experiment with a new technology, explore new possibilities, rather than be tied down to the old things, the old ways in which they used to do things?
So I think two of the elements you just highlighted might conflict with one another. Meaning, I'm with you on the experiment point. I think having a champion is good, but not that champion should prescribe how it should be used, to say it should be used in this way and not that way. Because I think that's the open question, is what way is it going to be effective, but maybe engendering opportunities for experimentation and then reflecting on the learnings from that experimentation to say, well, what seems to work and what doesn't in terms of how we use these tools.
Sure, but I don't disagree. But I do think that there still needs to be some sort of a narrative, a grand narrative that makes sense of how to use this technology within a business. And so we looked at another paper by Merit Enholm, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, where they do talk about some of these organizational capabilities that businesses need to have to be able to use this technology effectively. And they talk about AI strategy. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about narrative, a grand narrative. You need to have a strategy, a direction that makes people understand why and how we're expected to use these tools. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be heavily scripted. That I don't think that's very effective for such an open-ended tool.
Yeah, but have a plan in place.
Even the plan might be too specific a concept, but a narrative.
Interesting.
You need to have a story that people can buy into and understand what it is that they're doing and why they're using these tools. What kind of grand objectives are they trying to help with this experimentation with this new technology? Sure. So just putting it in there and letting people play with it without having any of these structures or processes in place, it might work, but it might not work. And by the way, I anticipate that at least in some cases, the technology is going to be used in industries and sectors that are very heavily regulated. People have talked about the legal industry and how generative AI can be used there. That's a pretty heavily regulated industry. You can't just do whatever you want to do and hope for the best. Which reminds me of
or medicine.
Yeah, that's another one.
And I think there's good use cases for the tools in medicine, including that we know These tools are better at scanning for malignancy in images, in cell imagery. And certainly medicine is very heavily regulated domain. So yeah, I think you could be quite right on that intuition.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think you've actually done a good job of summarizing a lot of the managerial takeaways. And so I don't know that we don't need to go back to that unless there's clear others that you want to glean. There is one piece of this whole discussion that I would love to just touch on at some point, which is the part of the more optimistic view. I think I have tended to take a more sanguine view of the potential for these tools to enhance our work lives. And one of the things I often hear people comment, you hear about technology displacement and things like that. But at least in most of the Western democracies, a lot of people have talked about how we're below replacement birth rate. We've been below replacement birth rate for throughout most of Western Europe for more than a decade, in the United States for just the last couple of years. But, the thinking is, well, what are we going to do as we have this graying society, right? Society within these countries gets older, and you have fewer and fewer young adults trying to support and replace the productivity of more and more older adults. Well, I got a solution for you, it would appear.
Have sex with AI?
No. If these tools are really significant productivity enhancers, it means that fewer young people could replace more older people with the enhancement of the technology, with the support and enhancement of the technology. The sex with AI is not going to turn around the birth rates for sure. And in fact, it will almost surely decimate the birth rates.
But on that point that you just made about productivity gains, there was another study that I think supports the argument which we didn't talk about before. This is a study by Damioli et al. From 2021, titled "The Impact of AI on Labor Productivity." And what I don't know if you've looked at that one.
I did, yeah.
So they sampled.
They looked at patents, AI-based patents. Was this the one?
Yeah, AI patent applications across thousands of different companies from all over the world between 2020 and 2016, and they found a significant relationship between application of AI patents and productivity growth, labor productivity rather. So in terms of AI patent applications, doubling in the number of AI patent applications increased labor productivity by 3%, which may sound negligible, but I guess when you look at large numbers, it adds up to being quite significant. And
but also that data set ended at 2016, and I think the last 7 years have seen some substantive gains in this regard. I'd be curious to see if that data were updated through 2023.
I guess that's a study that needs to be written, and even applications of non-AI patents helped productivity. So a doubling in that number led to a productivity of, again, almost 3%.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly with service firms, it needs to be added as opposed to manufacturing. And when we look at manufacturing firms, it was particularly high-tech manufacturing firms versus low-tech that were able to leverage these labor productivity gains. And it was specifically SMEs, so small to medium enterprises.
Small, medium-sized enterprises, yeah.
With AI patent applications as opposed to large firms.
Now, that was a straight econometrics analysis, and it was interesting that it does suggest, some real knowledge stock gains as a result of the application of artificial intelligence. But that does sort of reinforce my perspective that this could be a real solution for this very clear point of concern throughout, certainly, again, most advanced democracies or advanced economies where birth rates have fallen consistently. And people worry about depopulation. That's another one of Elon's worries: depopulation rather than population growth, because you have to sort of replace that productivity. Well, how do you do it? Seems like a possible lever to me.
So to sum up the conversation, are we ending on a positive note? Is that what you're saying?
Let's do that. Let's do that. That is good. Yes.
Well, that's a first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'm happy with that.
Good. Yeah, for sure. So despite our rebranding, we're going to try to keep our favorite things.
Let's do it.
Yeah. And I think our thinking was that we would go back. We'll start looping back to some of the categories we've done before. And since this is a podcast, in our first podcast as the Management Lab, we'll go back to some of our favorite podcasts.
Okay, who's going first? Are you going first today?
I think you should go first because yours is more interesting. Mine is a little more widespread, much as I love it.
Okay, so my recommended podcast is Australian. It is called The Minefield, not the mind field, but The Minefield. And it's a radio show that's also available as a podcast. So if anyone's interested, I'm pretty sure you can find it everywhere. It's hosted by Waleed Ali, who's an Australian journalist and commentator. And I'm blanking out on the other person's name. Scott Stevens. Scott Stevens, who's, by the way, I think he's American.
Interesting.
He's
let them in once in a while.
Definitely a North American accent. And what they do there is they tackle current events from an ethical perspective. And both of them have intriguing personalities, and they're knowledgeable, and they have oftentimes very revealing conversations that help shed light and rethink some of, I guess, the perspectives that tend to be taken for granted in mainstream media about some of the topics of the day. It's not necessarily Australian specific. I mean, sometimes they would touch on topics that are particularly relevant for Australian politics or society, but that's not necessarily the case. So even people who are not from here are likely to find this interesting.
I'm really excited to check it out. I have never listened to it, and it sounds like the kind of thing that would be right up my alley. So I'm definitely going to check it out. One of the interesting things to me is you noted that it's a radio show, but it's a podcast now. This is like the blending of all media. One of the things that has occurred to me recently is somebody was talking about how all the streaming services, the television streaming services, are going to start putting in advertising. And all I could think is, oh, so you mean television? Right? Like, we're just going back. It's very McLuhan-esque, right? We're just reverting back to older things that we've already seen. And same thing, like a podcast, sure, it's like radio. Fortunately, you and I have not, I don't know if this is fortunate or unfortunate, have not used any advertising yet and don't intend to integrate any advertising. But like in a lot of the podcasts I listen to, and you get every 10 minutes, the podcast or the advertisement for fast growing trees or something like that. So anyway.
So what's your,
I just gave them a free ad. That was bad of me. Mine is sort of an OG podcaster. So OG meaning original gangster, old school, which is Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. So for anyone who's a history fan, if you haven't listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, you really need to go. He'll do 4-hour episodes. He has released them much more slowly, but the catalog still exists out there. 4-hour episodes. He might have a given series, like I think his World War I series, which was called Countdown to Armageddon. Each episode was probably about 4 hours, and he did 6 episodes. So that's a day's worth of content. And it's just so rich. It's so well researched. It's still engaging. Like it's amazing to me how he just keeps the narrative flowing. He's got a great voice for podcasting in general. If you're a history fan, you need to check it out. Particularly military history. It's called Hardcore History because it's all ultimately military history.
Yeah,
but it's really good.
I've listened to the First World War series, and he's very good. He has a real knack for kind of pulling you into the situation, makes you feel like you're actually there, even though it's just words, right? There's no images, it's just a podcast, but he's really good at what he does, and it's extremely well researched. So I join the recommendation.
Excellent. Cool. All right, Uri. Well, that was a great discussion. I think maybe we'll move off of AI next time around, but I'm sure we're coming back to it sooner or later.
Sounds good. I'll talk to you soon, Sean.
All right. Later.
Later.